Bismillah, in the next section here, we're looking at the obligations and nullifiers of Tayammum. We're also going to look at the description of Tayammum as well. To do that, in this chapter, Faslun fi furud Tayammumi wa mubtilatihi. Imam al-Buhuti, he says, وَفُرُوضُهُ مَسْحُ وَجْهِهِ وَيَدَيْهِ إِلَى كُوعِهِ وَتَعْيِينُ نِيَّةِ اسْتِبَاحَةِ مَا يُتَيَمَّمُ لَهُ مِنْ حَدَثٍ أَوْ نَجِسٍ وَكَذَا تَرْتِيبٌ وَمُوَالَاةٌ فِي حَدَثٍ أَصْغَرٍ وإن نوى حدثا أو نجسا لم يجزئه عن الآخر وإن نواهما كفى وإن نوى نفلا أو أطلق لم يصل به فرضا وإن نواه صلى كل وقته فروضا ونوافله. Here we're talking about the basics, the obligations first. So Imam al-Buhuti says the following are obligations of tayammum. Number 1, wiping the face. So basically we're going to be looking at 5 things. 3 of these things are like, universal in application for all scenarios for tayammum, and then 2 of these things are specific in application. Right? The first is wiping the face, and this is based on the verse, and wipe their faces in Surah Al-Ma'idah. And this, of course, excludes any skin under your hair. Okay, we're wiping the face, under the skin under your hair, for example. Even if the hair is sparse, you just have to wipe over the face. It is disliked, by the way, to put dirt in your mouth and your nose in this process. Typically we know that that's part of the wudu process. The mouth and the nose are considered min al-zahir, but we're not going to be doing that for tayammum or putting it in your eyes. The second obligation is based on the same verse when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically says, and your hands. Remember, it says, wipe their faces and their hands in the verse. And this includes wiping both hands to the wrist. And the wrist is marked by the protruding bone, okay, after the thumb. That's it right there. That bone right there. That's the wrist bone here. After the thumb is right there. That's what's mentioned. So this is the hand up into the wrist. The protruding bone just after the thumb. And so the forearms are not to be wiped. It should be noted that, by the way, when a ruling is connected to the yed, the hand, without any specification, it's referring to that part up to the wrist bone. And we can see that when it comes to touching the private part with your hand. It doesn't include the forearm, even the elbow, or when severing the hand of the thief. And this is also further illustrated in the hadith of Ammar ibn Yasir, who said that the Prophet ﷺ sent me on an errand and I became junub, meaning sexually impure. I couldn't find any water. I rolled myself around in the dirt just as an animal does. Okay, so he has an idea that there's a earth-based purification process. He rolls himself around in the earth just as an animal does. I then went to the Prophet ﷺ and mentioned that to him, and he said, this would have been enough for you. And he struck the earth with his hands once, then he wiped the right hand with the left one, the outside of the palms, his hands, and his face. Muttafaqun alayh. Can also be done by wiping the obligatory parts of the body over earth and then wiping them with the hands or exposing them so that earth can be blown on them by the wind and then wiping over them with the hands. Of course, this is done with an intention. Basically, what we're doing here, what we're trying to illustrate is here some alternatives. Right? Instead of striking the earth, you can wipe those body parts on the earth and then wipe over them with the hand. Or in the event that there's wind that's blowing earth, you can basically expose yourself to that so that the wind blows that dust or that earth onto those parts, and then wiping over them in both occasions. Of course, you need to have the requisite intention. And this is similar to wudu. So in the event that it's raining, you can go out and expose your body parts that need to be washed, and with the intention, and then obviously intending to go in order, etc., with continuity, you can have the rainwater fall on you to complete your wudu process. So this is valid. Haphazardly happening? No. There has to be an intention, and that, the wiping part has to occur. So that's number 1 and number 2. The third obligation is making an intention to permit what tayammum is being made for due to a major or minor hadith or impurity on the body. So here's an intention. One might say, well, wait a minute, an intention, why is that included in the obligations? Good question. And the Imam here, Imam al-Bahuti, rahimahullah ta'ala, he is following after al-Muntaha in this case. Muntaha al-Iradat noted the intention as one of the obligations to make the third of 5. If you look in al-Iqna'a, you'll find that it's not mentioned there because it's a prerequisite, as it is for all acts of worship. The intention is a prerequisite, and so in al-Iqna'a, I believe it's only 4 obligations that are mentioned. This one is a prerequisite. Either way, it has to be done, right? It has to be done. So, some notes about the intention here. Give a couple of examples, some scenarios. If one is in a state of janaba, the intention should be to permit the act of worship due to the state of janaba. If there is a hadith, we're not talking about janaba now, it's a hadith, it should be done due to that hadith. Or if there's najasa on the body, it should be done to basically permit that act of worship due to the najasa. You know, here's why are we being so specific? Because the intention for wudu and ghusl are not as specific as this. It's because tayammum doesn't actually eliminate a hadith, nor does it remove najasa. It's not water-based. It doesn't remove. It doesn't eliminate. What it does, as considered as an exigent form of purification, it's a darura. Okay, it's not the standard. It's a darura. It's an exigent form of purification, and therefore this highly specified intention is required in order to strengthen the nature of the tayammum. So, for example, if one were to intend a general hadith, it would not suffice both major and minor hadiths. An intention due to both major and minor hadiths together would be required instead. Like we talked about that before. You're going to make ghusl, you can intend hadith. In general, it's going to remove both the major and the minor, but here for tayammum, it will not. You have to have an intention for both if that's what you want to do. You have to intend that you're going to make tayammum in order to perform this act, this prayer, for Dhuhr prayer, because of the major and minor hadith together. And in that case, it will suffice. Or if one were to intend the removal of a hadith, the tayammum would not be valid because it does not remove it but permits worship. So basically, here's the wrong intention. If you're making tayammum to remove, remember to eliminate a hadith. That's not the intention because tayammum doesn't eliminate a hadith. So if that was the intention, it would not be valid. Remember now, the intention is just permitting prayer because of a hadith, because of the khabath on the body. That's important. Okay, so those are the first 3 kind of universal obligations. The next 2, the 4th and the 5th, include observing both sequence by wiping the face before the hands and continuity by not allowing enough time to pass so that one limb dries before the other is addressed had it been washed with water. It's basically an estimate of time here. You're not using water, but you would estimate how much time that would be from one to the other, much like wudu. And that's the continuity. Remember, that's not allowing too much time to pass before the second limb is addressed. So these 2, sequence and continuity, as you can imagine, are both specific for a minor hadith, meaning it's not universal in the tayammum process. It only applies to when you're trying to remove a minor hadith and not a major hadith. And some examples of how that plays out were mentioned previously. And this is basically similar to the requirements of wudu, right? For minor hadith, you have to have wudu, observing both sequence and continuity. An intention made for either a hadith while there is also najasa on the body or impurity while a hadith is present will not suffice the other, though an intention for both will. Again, we're going back to that the highly specific nature of the intention in tayammum. Okay, so if you have a hadith and you intend to make tayammum for the sake of that hadith while you also have impurity on the body, it's not enough. Now you have to make another one for that impurity, right? But what you should be doing is making an intention to remove the hadith as well as the khabath or the najasa that's present on the body, and that will be sufficient. Same thing goes for an intention for either a major hadith or minor. One will not suffice the other, though an intention for both will. And if all three are intended, meaning a major hadith, a minor hadith, and najasa, one tayammum is sufficient for that intent. It's also sufficient to intend one of the causes of a hadith for all others that are present, so long as the intention was not restricted for that sole cause. And we've talked about this with a water-based purification in removing only one thing. Here we're talking about permitting prayer for from only one specific thing. So like if it's a minor hadith, we know there are multiple causes for that, multiple things that are considered a hadith. So you may have like multiple things that you have done. You've used the restroom, you've passed wind, etc. So you can intend one of those and it will be sufficient for all of them, so long as you don't intend only one. You say only this thing. But you can intend that one thing without being restricted, and it will suffice the rest. Imam al-Bahuti says, if an intention is made for a voluntary prayer or prayer in general, the obligatory prayer cannot be prayed. Again, back to the highly specific nature. This is because the obligatory prayer was not intended, and so it was not permitted to be made. What is permitted in both scenarios, meaning above if you intended voluntary prayer or just prayer in general, is voluntary prayer. It's permitted to pray voluntary prayer, not the obligatory prayer. If an intention is made for an obligation, like an obligatory prayer, every prayer, be it obligatory or voluntary, can be prayed during its time period. Basically, the obligatory prayer and everything that is lesser in degree. And that's the nature of the intention, is that the intention includes the thing that you're intending and everything that is lesser in degree. And that, by the way, is as follows, right? So you understand what the ranking of things are. The first is the individual obligation. This is fardu ayn. So like Dhuhr prayer, for example, Fajr prayer. An oath to pray. After that is fardu kifaya, a communal obligation like a funeral prayer. After that is a voluntary prayer. After that is obligatory prayer for tawaf. After that is a voluntary prayer for tawaf. After that is touching the mushaf, then reciting the Quran, then remaining in the masjid. Those are kind of like, that's the hierarchy of intention, if you will, for specific actions. So if you intend one up here, everything below it is permitted. But if you're intending something in the middle, then you can't jump up. Okay, you can't go up. So if you intended a voluntary prayer, it's not going to include your obligatory prayers with that tayammum. The next section talks about what invalidates tayammum. Imam says, وَيَبْطُلُ تَيَمُّمُهُ بِخُرُوجِ وَقْتٍ وَمُبْطِلِ مَا تَيَمَّمَ لَهُ وَوُجُودِ مَاءٍ وَلَوْ فِي صَلَاةٍ لَا بَعْدَهَا وَالتَّيَمُّمُ آخِرَ الْوَقْتِ لِرَاجِ الْمَاءِ أَوْلَى. Says tayammum is voided due to expiry or entrance of time. It's two things. The expiration or the beginning or the entrance of the time, even if it was made for something other than prayer, right? So prayers obviously have times. There's other things, they may have their own times. If tayammum was made for Fajr, this is an example, it is invalidated at the shuruq, meaning the shuruq is the end of Fajr time. If tayammum was made after the shuruq, it is invalidated at the zawal. If tayammum was made to pray a janazah prayer, in the scenario that is a janazah, you make tayammum. Remember when we said tayammum for the janazah prayer is after the body's been washed. Then that's when you make tayammum for janazah prayer. Now technically, after the janazah prayer is over, the time for janazah prayer is over. So that means that if another janazah came, right, there was another body now they need to pray janazah over, you need to make tayammum for that next janazah. Unless there's no time for you to do that, then they permit it in that case. Okay, if you do have the time, all of a sudden here comes another janazah. Now we need to make tayammum for that janazah prayer. And you carry on. All right, because tayammum is an exigent form of purification. This is a darura. It's restricted to its time. This is the case even if the time expires while in prayer. Okay, so if you are in prayer and you're running late to where you started the prayer on time and the remainder of the prayer is going to be performed outside of its time, halfway through that time expires, Tayammum has been invalidated because of that. With the exception of Jummah prayer, there's a couple of exceptions here. Jummah prayer, because Jummah prayer is not something that can be made up. The other ones can be made up. Or when intended to delay prayers to the second prayer's time due to travel, right? When you can delay your prayer. So the first prayer, you've intended to delay it to the second prayer's time. Now you're not worried about the expiry of that time period. Or when tayammum is made up for a make-up prayer and made during the first prayer's time. All right, so in that case, you're not worried about the expiry of the time to that degree when making up a prayer. It is also invalidated by any invalidator for which tayammum was made. Okay, so falling asleep basically would invalidate the tayammum made in place of wudu, and intercourse would invalidate tayammum made in the place of ghusl. So if you made tayammum and then you fell asleep, your tayammum is invalidated. If it was made for hadith asghar. If you made tayammum in place of a ghusl and then you had intercourse, then the tayammum is invalidated. It's much the same way. The same rules kind of apply when invalidating these alternatives. So in the event that tayammum was made for both major and minor hadiths, and then you passed wind, for example, what would happen? You remember we said we can combine the intentions here. Right? So we made tayammum for both a major and a minor hadith, but now we've basically invalidated what would be considered like a minor hadith. So what would happen is the entirety of the tayammum invalidated, and now we have to go make tayammum again for both the major and the minor? No. In this case, it's partially, if I could use that term loosely, partially invalidated, basically for the minor hadith, but not the major. So then when you have to go and make tayammum again, the intention only requires that you make tayammum for the minor hadith and not the major. It's also invalidated by the presence of water, which can be accessed and used without harm, even if it be a meager amount. So now water became available, but guess what? It's not enough water to completely make wudu, but there is water available. Because the water is available now, your tayammum is invalidated. That's right. So it means that you have to go even make that partial wudu so that the water is no longer available and it's been utilized, and then you make tayammum when needed, right? For what you were unable to complete with the water-based purification. And this is the case even if it was found during prayer or tawaf. In the event that while you're in prayer, all of a sudden water becomes available, both are invalidated. If you're making prayer or tawaf, and a water-based purification must be made and the act started over. But not if water becomes available after the act is completed. Okay, so after you've already prayed and then, oh look, the water came back on. You've completed your obligation. It is, however, considered preferred to make the prayer again if the water is found, unless it is a prohibited time, such as praying after Asr or after Fajr prayer. Tayammum is also invalidated when what permitted it ceases, such as that wound or an illness. Okay, so that gives you some ideas about invalidators of tayammum. To conclude this section, he says it is preferred to delay tayammum to the latest possible preferred time. This is waqt al-mukhtar. To the last possible preferred time for the prayers that have preferred times, such that the entire prayer can be made within that time and not after that time for one who hopes to find water. Meaning that you're going to delay it, but not to the point that some of the prayers performed out of that preferred time. And this is because purification with water for prayer is an obligation, while praying at the beginning of the time is considered a virtue. It's the difference between farida and fadila, right? The farida is the obligation. You're obliged to perform water-based purification. Praying early, meaning the beginning of its time, is a virtue. It's extra. It's an extra reward. So what you're going to do is you're going to fulfill your obligations before you go seeking extra reward. And so you have to delay in the event that water can become available. If you hope and it's plausible, or you're almost certain that water is going to come on, you have to wait and delay. You can't go, look, we just got here's a scenario. We just got a phone call from the water company. This happens, by the way, depending on how organized your system is. Just got a phone call from the water company that said that the water is going to be out for the next 2 hours. And considering it's only 9 a.m. and Dhuhr is not till 1, or let's say, no, that wouldn't be a good scenario. Let's say like it's 1 o'clock, Dhuhr prayer, and Asr doesn't come in until 5 o'clock. We have 5 hours. In 2 hours, the water's going to be back on. We need to wait until those 2 hours pass by, and then the water comes on. And then obviously, then we need to exhaust all other means and avenues to finding water in order to permit tayammum. The last part we're going to look at here is the description of tayammum, sifatu tayammum. Imam al-Bahuti says, وَصِفَتُهُ أن ينوي ثم يسمي ويضرب التراب بيديه مفرجتي الأصابع بعد النزع نحو خاتم ضربة يمسح وجهه بباطن أصابعه وكفيه براحتيه ويخلل أصابعه. Basically, its description is as follows. You make an intention, such as permitting what is being made for, like an obligatory prayer, dhuhr, tawaf, whatever, due to a major or minor hadith or impurity on the body, or a combination of all those things. Major hadith, minor hadith, and impurity, as previously discussed. And then you say, Bismillah. This is an obligation. After removing any rings or jewelry that can get in the way, much like preventing water from the skin, preventing the dust from coming in contact with the skin, you strike the earth once with both open-fingered hands, then wipe the entire face with the palm side of the fingers. Right, so you've come in contact with the entirety of the hand, so there's going to be dust on the palm, there's going to be dust on the fingers. Wiping over the face is done with the palm side of the fingers. Okay, recommended here. This is a technical issue, right? It's a technical issue, and at this level, as you know, we've been tackling some of these technical issues. If a part of the face was not wiped, remember, the idea for tayammum is to wipe the entirety of the face. So if a part of it was not wiped, so long as the hand has not left the face, you're still in the process of wiping and you realize, oh, I missed a spot. So long as the hand is still in contact with the face, you can run over that part that was missed regardless if there's any earth or dust that remains on the hand or not. You may have exhausted the dust on your fingers going halfway, and then you missed the part, you have to go back. So long as the hand is still there and hasn't been removed from the face, then you can go back over it even if there's no more dust. If you remove the hand and there's still something that has to be wiped over to get a complete wipe, that means and there's no dust on your hand, you now have to restrike the earth to put dust on the hand. If there is dust that remains, even after having come and removed the hand from the face, then you can go back to wiping it. Okay, so the difference here is, if there's dust, you removed your hand, you can wipe. If you removed your hand, there's no dust, you have to strike to get dust and then wipe. If there's no dust and your hand has not come off, then you can wipe, doesn't matter. So that is because we're required to wipe the entirety of the face. This is then followed by the outer part of the hands being wiped with the palms. Remember, we wiped the face with the palm side fingers. Now we're going to be using the actual palm to wipe over the hands, as he says, wiping each hands with the palms and then wiping each hand's fingers between each other, right? Between each other, so that earth gets between them. And in this process, it is permissible to do 2 strikes on the earth if needed. So 1 strike for the face and 1 strike for the hands. And that will conclude this section.